Cha Min-jae had walked into burning buildings. He had sat across tables from men who had already decided he wouldn't leave the room, and he had left every single one. He had never, not once in 16 years, stood anywhere without knowing exactly why, until that Wednesday evening. She didn't even know he was home. She had no idea that the most dangerous man in Seoul was frozen in his own doorway, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do the one thing his entire life had been built around, staying in control. His breath stopped in his chest. His feet refused the exit. And somewhere behind the armor he had been constructing since he was 24 years old, something gave way so quietly and so completely that he would spend the next 4 weeks pretending he hadn't heard it. He had come home at the wrong time. Or maybe, and this thought would find him at 3 a.m. in cities he flew to trying to outrun it, he had come home at exactly the right one. This is the story of the coldest man in Seoul. And the woman who, without trying, without knowing, without ever once making herself smaller than she was, became the one thing he had no strategy for. Seoul doesn't move. Seoul operates. Every street, every tower, every transaction running like code in a system with no patience for disorder and no room for anything that doesn't serve a function. And at the very top of that system, in a penthouse on the south bank of the Han River that looked over the city the way a blade looks over a table, was Cha Min-jae, 40 years old. Feared not through spectacle, but through the particular quality of his silence, the kind that made experienced men recalculate mid-sentence. He took over the Hyukryong organization at 24. Stepped into the space his father left and filled it so completely that within 2 years, nobody spoke of the previous leader at all. 16 years later, he had doubled the organization's reach, removed 4 men who mistook patience for permission, and built a public front in commercial real estate so clean that the prosecutors who tried twice eventually went looking for easier problems. His penthouse was the physical expression of everything he was. Not lavish. Precise. Every person in his life assigned a function, trusted to stay within it. Lizzie Bright had been inside that world for 8 months before he looked at her and registered that she was a person with opinions. She came from Lagos, Nigeria. 26. A hospitality degree, a mother's medical debt, and 2 younger sisters whose futures she carried not as a burden, but as a fact of herself. She knew who Cha Min-jae was before she walked through his door. She decided, with a calm deliberateness that was simply how Lizzie moved through the world, that none of it was her concern. Her concern was the work, and she was exceptional at it. But Lizzie Bright was not a woman who made herself small so other people could feel large. She occupied exactly the space she was entitled to. Never 1 inch less. Most people in her position learned invisibility quickly. She never tried. The first time Min-jae felt this, he was passing the kitchen. She was reorganizing the pantry, humming something low and rhythmic, something that had the feeling of a specific place in it. She glanced up, gave him her usual composed nod, and went back to her work. He stood in the doorway for 4 full seconds. For Cha Min-jae, that was an unusual amount of time to stand anywhere without a reason. He told himself it was nothing. He had acquisitions closing, reports that needed answers, a Tokyo meeting requiring full preparation. He did not have the time or the interest to think about his housekeeper. He almost believed it. Then came the Wednesday evening that broke everything open. Welcome to Afro-Korean Cartel Stories. Today's episode has everything. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Share this with someone who loves a slow burn that pays off. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The Hyukryong organization was not just a gang, it was a ghost. For 16 years, Cha Min-jae made sure of that. From his penthouse high above the Han River, he ran his empire like a ticking watch. Every second was planned. Every guard, driver, and worker had a set job. If someone made a mistake, they were gone. Min-jae lived in a world of black suits, silent car rides, and cold looks. He did not have friends. He had pieces on a game board. His life was a math problem with no room for error. Lizzie Bright was not a game piece. Back in Lagos, she had a clear plan. Her mother's medical bills were piling up, and her 2 younger sisters needed money for school. So, Lizzie took the job in Seoul. She packed her bags, leaving the warm Nigerian sun for the cold glass walls of Min-jae's home. She knew he was a dangerous boss, but she did not care. She was there to work, save her money, and go home. In the penthouse, Lizzie moved like a calm river. She was never rushed, but she was always perfectly on time. While other workers kept their heads down and tried to hide, Lizzie stood tall. She wore her crisp black and white uniform with pride. When she placed his black coffee on the glass table, her hand never shook. She did not whisper to make herself small. If she needed to ask him a question about the daily schedule, she looked right into his dark eyes. She was amazing at her job. The floors shined, the meals were flawless, and the penthouse felt warm for the first time in years. Min-jae was used to people shrinking away from him out of fear. But Lizzie just walked past his dark moods, completely ignoring the invisible crown on his head. She did the work, but she refused to disappear. Min-jae was a man who noticed everything, but he usually only looked for threats. Lizzie was not a threat, so for a while, she was just part of the background. Then, the small moments started to add up. It began on a quiet evening. Min-jae walked down the hall and heard a soft, rich sound. He stopped in the shadows. Lizzie was sitting by the kitchen island, looking at her phone. She was laughing at a video, completely relaxed and unguarded. Her smile reached her eyes, making the large, empty room feel instantly brighter. He watched her for a second, feeling a strange pull in his chest, before walking away in silence. A few days later, he went into his huge library to find a book. He stopped and stared at the shelves. The books were moved. They were no longer grouped by their topics. Lizzie had sorted them by mood. Dark, heavy books sat on the lower shelves, while lighter, hopeful stories climbed toward the ceiling. He frowned, ready to be angry that someone touched his things. But as he reached out, his hand fell exactly on the book he needed. It made perfect sense. She had understood his space better than he did. Then came the morning with the building contractor. A loud, angry man stood at the front door, complaining about a delayed delivery. Min-jae stepped out of his office to shut the man down. But Lizzie was already there. She stood tall in her crisp black and white uniform. She spoke quietly, but her voice was very firm. She smiled and offered the angry man a glass of water, but she did not back down an inch. Within a minute, the man was calm, nodding and apologizing. She handled him with a mix of warmth and strictness that Min-jae had never seen before. Min-jae walked back into his cold office and closed the heavy door. He sat at his black desk and pulled out his paperwork. He told himself it did not matter. He went back to his work, but something deep inside his perfect machine had shifted. Min-jae never changed his schedule. Knowing exactly what would happen kept him safe. But on a rainy Wednesday evening, a meeting ended early, and he came back to the penthouse without warning. The huge apartment was quiet. He dropped his keys on the glass table and walked toward his private sitting room. He expected the usual dark, empty space. Instead, he pushed the heavy door open and stopped dead in his tracks. Lizzie was there. She had her white earphones in and her eyes tightly closed. She was dancing. Her movements were slow, smooth, and completely free. The white apron of her uniform swayed over her dark dress as she spun in the fading evening light. In a room built for cold business, she looked warm and beautifully alive. She had no idea the most dangerous man in Seoul was standing just feet away. Min-jae did not speak. He did not step back. For 3 full minutes, he stood frozen in the doorway. He watched her move like the world belonged to her. His chest tightened. His perfect, icy control shattered into tiny pieces. He could not look away. He was terrified, not by an enemy, but by the sudden, heavy beating of his own heart. Then she turned. Lizzie opened her large, defined eyes and saw him standing in the shadows. Most people would jump or gasp. Lizzie did not. She simply stopped dancing. She stood tall, looked right into his dark eyes without a trace of fear, and pulled out one earphone. "I didn't hear you come in," she said. Her voice was perfectly calm. "I will clear out." She walked past him, her rich ombre curls bouncing slightly. She did not look back. Min-jae was left alone in the quiet room. He stood in the exact same spot for 4 more minutes. He stared at the empty space where she had been, unable to make sense of the chaos in his mind. The very next morning, before the sun even came up, he boarded a flight to Tokyo. Tokyo was a city of bright lights and sharp deals. Min-jae sat in a dark room with angry men. He fixed the problem with his supplier using his usual cold perfection. His voice was flat. His eyes were like ice. He was fully there, doing his job without missing a beat. But in the back of his mind, the memory of Wednesday evening was still playing. He kept seeing Lizzie spinning in his quiet room. Running away to Japan did not fix anything. He returned to Seoul 3 days later. It was past midnight when he walked into his penthouse. The air was cool and silent. He took off his heavy black overcoat and walked into the kitchen. The lights were dim. On the clean marble counter, he found a covered plate of food. Next to it rested a small white piece of paper. He picked up the note. It was written in Lizzie's neat handwriting. It did not say, "Welcome home," or ask how his trip went. It just gave simple directions on how to heat the meal. Min-jae stood in the empty kitchen, holding the small piece of paper. He held it long after he had read the words. He felt the thin paper between his fingers, trying hard to ignore the strange warmth growing in his chest. The next morning, the sun poured into the dining room. Lizzie was setting his dark coffee on the glass table, her black and white uniform perfectly crisp. Min-jae looked up at her. He did not ask about his daily schedule. "What was the song?" he asked. His voice was low. Lizzie stopped for a second. She did not ask what he meant. She met his dark eyes with a calm look. "It is a song my grandmother used to sing," she said softly. "At weddings back in Lagos." Min-jae looked at her. He did not say a single word back. He just took his coffee. But as he drank it, he locked every word she had just said deep inside his mind. The quiet of the penthouse slowly began to change. It was no longer an empty silence. It was a space waiting to be filled. One evening, while Lizzie was wiping the glass kitchen island, Min-jae did not go straight to his office. He stood near the large window, looking out at the dark city. "Tell me about Lagos," he said. He did not ask out of simple politeness. Lizzie could hear it in his deep voice. So, she told him the truth. She did not paint a perfect picture. She told him about the heavy, sticky heat that hugged the skin. She talked about the loud, crazy traffic, the bright colors, and the fierce pride of a city that moved like it owned the whole world. As she spoke, Min-jae listened. He did not look at his phone or check his watch. He gave her his complete attention, something very powerful men almost never do. Lizzie noticed. She felt the weight of his dark eyes, and it made her chest feel strangely warm. "And your sisters?" he asked softly. She smiled, her face lighting up as she talked about their big dreams and loud laughs. Then she paused. She looked at his sharp, serious face and asked a careful question back. "What about your family?" Min-jae went very still. "My father is gone. My sister and I built different lives," he answered. His voice was flat, but a heavy silence followed his words. It was a thick, cold quiet that held years of hidden pain. Lizzie did not push. She did not offer fake pity. She just nodded and held that quiet space for him, letting him be safe in his silence. When he finally turned to walk down the hall, the air between them felt completely different. They were no longer just a cold boss and a maid sharing a large apartment. In the shadows of the perfect, icy penthouse, they were two people finally beginning to see each other. Min-jae's men would not understand what he did next. For 16 years, Sunday meant business. It was the day he read secret reports and planned his next moves. But this week, he completely cleared his schedule. He ordered his team not to call him. At 9 in the morning, he sat on the dark sofa in his living room. He held no files. He had no plan. He was simply sitting in the quiet when Lizzie walked through. She paused for a second, a little surprised to see him resting. She gave him a calm nod and went straight to the kitchen. Soon, the warm smell of breakfast filled the cool air. Min-jae did not stay on the couch. He got up, walked into the kitchen, and sat at the glass island. He watched her cook. She did not ask why he was there. She just plated the food, poured him a cup of dark coffee, and made herself a cup of tea. Then, they began to talk. 1 hour passed, and then 2. They talked about simple things, letting the heavy outside world melt away. Min-jae's coffee turned cold in his cup. Lizzie's tea stopped steaming. Neither of them noticed. Then, Lizzie told a story about a very stubborn goat near her home in Lagos. She copied the angry animal's face so perfectly that Min-jae could not stop himself. A deep, real laugh slipped right out of his chest. It was a rich, warm sound that filled the empty kitchen. Min-jae froze. He looked completely shocked by his own face. He had worn a cold mask for so long that he had forgotten what his own laugh felt like. Lizzie stopped moving. She saw the bright, rare spark in his dark eyes. A sudden, dangerous flutter woke up in her chest. She knew it was not safe to feel this way about a mafia boss. So, she quickly tucked the sweet moment deep into the back of her mind, refusing to look at it too closely. While Min-jae was clearing his Sundays, Oh Se-won was busy working in the shadows. Se-won was the deputy director of the Hyukryong organization. For 18 months, he had been quietly stealing money from the group's construction businesses. He was very careful, taking just enough to stay hidden. But lately, Min-jae had started asking sharp questions about the quarterly numbers. Se-won knew it was only a matter of time before the cold boss found the missing money. Fear is a dangerous thing, but Se-won was a smart man. He knew he could not fight Min-jae directly. If he wanted to survive, he needed to create a major distraction. He needed a fire big enough to make Min-jae look away from the business numbers. And to make a fire, Se-won needed fuel. Se-won had learned how to be cold and patient by watching Min-jae for years. He did not rush. Instead, he started watching the penthouse. He paid off a building guard to take pictures. The photos showed Min-jae coming home much earlier than usual. They showed grocery bags filled with ingredients no one in the wealthy building ever bought. Se-won took these small clues and built a dangerous story about a weak boss losing his focus over a maid. With his trap ready, Se-won moved smoothly. He set up quiet meetings with 3 of the oldest, most strict family leaders in the gang. He showed them the photos and whispered polite, deadly worries about Min-jae's choices. Finally, he made sure a very careful message reached Cha Soo-yeon, Min-jae's older sister, who cared deeply about the family's perfect public image. Se-won did not shout or make wild threats. He was not reckless. He simply planted poisonous seeds in the right places and stepped back into the shadows to watch them grow. The trap was perfectly set, waiting to snap shut on the quiet. Warm World Min-jae and Lizzie were just beginning to build. Cha Soo-yeon did not call before she arrived. As Min-jae's older sister, she did not have to. She walked into the penthouse looking sharp and perfect in a tailored gray suit. Soo-yeon was not a mean person. She loved her brother, but her love came with heavy rules. They had built the family's safe, public image together, and she guarded it fiercely. She sat gracefully on the dark leather sofa. Min-jae poured her a glass of water. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then she spoke. Her voice was smooth and calm. "The oldest families are talking, Min-jae," she said softly. "They are whispering about your focus. They say you are distracted." She did not yell or make wild threats. She did not even mention Lizzie's name. She did not have to. In their dangerous world, a simple whisper was enough to start a war. "Our family name is a strong shield," Soo-yeon continued, looking right into his dark eyes. "But it can only carry so much weight. You know what we can survive, and you know what we cannot accept." Min-jae sat across from her. He did not argue or defend himself. He knew this was Se-won's trap working perfectly in the background. His sister was just delivering the final warning. "I understand," Min-jae said, his voice flat and controlled. "Thank you for coming, Soo-yeon." He stood up and politely walked her to the heavy front door. When it clicked shut, the penthouse felt huge and empty again. The cold shadows seemed to press in on him. Min-jae walked back into the middle of the living room and stood perfectly still. For 16 years, he had lived only for the organization. He had been a perfect, icy machine to keep everyone safe. But as he looked around the quiet room, thinking about the warm laughs and shared Sunday mornings, he finally made a choice. He decided exactly what kind of man he wanted to be from now on, and he decided what his life was actually for. Lizzie walked into the penthouse that evening and immediately felt the heavy air. She did not need anyone to tell her that something had happened. She did not hide or wait to be called. She walked straight to the sitting room where Min-jae was standing. "I will pack my bags," she said calmly, looking right into his dark eyes. "I am not afraid of your world, Min-jae. But I will not be the crack in your armor." Min-jae stepped forward. "The problem was Oh Se-won," he said, his voice steady. "And he is already handled. You do not have to leave to protect me." Then, the man who spent 16 years hiding his feelings did something completely new. He stopped managing the situation and simply told the truth. On that Wednesday evening, he said, his deep voice thick with emotion, "I should have announced myself and left. But I couldn't. I held the note you left with my food much longer than I needed to. And when you left that Sunday, it changed everything." He looked at her with total honesty. His walls were finally gone. I am not asking you to stay for me. I am asking you to stay for yourself if this is where you want to be. The choice has to be yours. Lizzie looked back at him. She saw the dangerous mafia boss, but she also saw the quiet man who had stood frozen in a doorway. She was Lizzie Bright, and every big choice she ever made was her own. She did not step back. She did not run. I am staying, she said softly. After that night, the world shifted. Oh Se-won quietly disappeared from the city. Cha Soo-yeon came over for tea and smiled politely at Lizzie. The older families simply adjusted to the new reality. And Cha Min-jae, the coldest man in Seoul, slowly learned the truth. His greatest power was not his icy control. His greatest power was standing in a doorway and choosing not to walk away. And that's a wrap on today's story. If this one pulled at something in your chest, then let us know in the comments. Tell us your favorite moment and where you're watching from. And if you're new here, welcome. Subscribe so you never miss a story. Like this video so more people find it. We'll see you in the next one. Please support by subscribing and commenting what you enjoyed about the story and where you're watching from.